I want to welcome all of you to the Monterey Conference Center and to this conference itself. I'm Dan Albert, the Mayor of Monterey, and what I'd like to do first is I would like to have everybody understand that this is a co-sponsorship by the City of Monterey, Pacific Grove, and Carmel by the Sea. Ken, did I say that right? I want to make sure that And while I'm doing that, I'd like to introduce the two mayors that are here from the other cities, and Ken White, the mayor of Carmel, and Sandy Kaufman, the mayor of Pacific Grove. And to make sure that I don't miss anything, I'm really going to just kind of set the ground rules for the day, and then the next introductions later on in the day will be done by Mayor Kaufman, and this afternoon they'll be done by Mayor White. And at 4 o'clock there will be a reception when this is all over, and that reception is sponsored by McPoa, the Canterbury Row Company, and the Monterey Plaza Hotel. We'll remind you again that these people are hosting this reception, and we feel that at the end of all of this, it will be a good time to discuss and a good time to talk to each other about what happened during the day. So let's give those sponsors a big hand too, because we appreciate their wanting to participate. Thank you. Now I'm going to do something that I generally don't do, but I'm going to read here so we kind of understand what the ground rules are and kind of the direction and where we're going, and then I will introduce the speakers, and I'll be off the stage, and we can get into the real meat of the conference. The city's decided to host this conference to outline historic preservation basics to citizens, commissioner, real estate professionals, builders, and private property owners, to explore what are the long-term benefits of historic preservation to a community and potential costs associated with historic preservation to property owners. This morning's session has been designed to answer the basic historic preservation questions, such as what makes a resource historic, what tools are available to preserve historic resources. The afternoon session will be a panel discussion to answer the more practical questions, such as are maintenance costs higher on historic buildings? What are insurance costs for historic buildings? What is the impact on real estate values? There will also be a panel discussion exploring incentives that are available to property owners. A general question and answer session will follow the afternoon session. Please turn in your index cards so that your questions can be considered by the panel. So that's important that we do that if you want to get some of your questions answered. And then I've already talked about the reception that will be held this evening, which will immediately follow the workshop at 4 p.m. Now I would like to introduce the speakers for this morning's session. They include Nora Winter. Nora Winter is an urban design and preservation consultant with more than 20 years' experience nationwide. He specializes in developing design recommendations for private developers and developing design guidelines for the communities. He has provided design review training for a wide range of locations, including the cities of Boston, Denver, Indianapolis, and New York. And in addition, he is currently working with the cities of Carmel and Pacific Grove on design guideline projects. Don Ripkame, got it, okay, Don, is the principal of the Real Estate Service Group, a Washington, D.C.-based real estate and economic development consulting firm. The firm specializes in service to private, public, and nonprofit sector clients who are dealing with downtown and neighborhood commercial districts, revitalization, and the reuse of historic structures. Bruce Judd is the principal of the Architecture Resource Group in San Francisco, and as a principal, he has been actively involved in the assessment of recommendations and rehabilitation of historic buildings. He has represented both private party owners and public agencies. And currently, Bruce is the project principal of the restoration of the Conservatory of Flowers in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And he's also the principal in charge of rehabilitation of Doc's Lab in Monterey and the current Sunset Center renovation in Carmel. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause and a big welcome, Monterey Peninsula welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I know that all of these folks really appreciate it, and I know that our communities at the end of this will appreciate the information and the knowledge that you've given to all of us. Thanks for being here, and now it's your show.
Where's that picture coming from? That's not what we want right now. We're going to use this for now. Yeah. Just that should do it. Okay, good morning. I'm Norrie Winter, and as the mayor said, I'm a consultant in historic preservation and urban design. I'm actually based in Boulder, Colorado, but I've had the opportunity of working around the country, and I can claim California as part of my heritage. You can tell from my accent, though it's Southern California. I am a graduate of UCLA and have fond memories of many of the communities here that are exploring new and creative ways of accomplishing historic preservation. It's certainly a movement that we've seen growing across the country. I'm going to be speaking both from my perspective as a practicing professional, but also for 4 years I served as the president of a national organization, the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, which is the membership organization of all local landmarks boards across the country. And so I've had an opportunity of gaining a great deal of understanding of what local preservation movements involve from that role as well. And from my perspective, preservation is a local movement. And while there certainly are national elements that you'll learn about today, you'll certainly see that my bias is that communities craft their own preservation methods. The questions that we've been asked to answer in a very brief time period this morning are: what is historic? What is preservation? Why should we bother to preserve historic resources? And then my cohort, Don Ripkema, will address what is the economic value of preservation. The limited definition of preservation that many of us have thought of is that preservation has to deal with operating historic building museums or protecting outstanding landmarks, the rare building that might exist in town, the courthouse or the famous battleground site, etc. But really, in today's world, there's a much broader definition that simply means keeping older buildings in continuing service while respecting their character and maintaining livable neighborhoods that have distinct identities. It's a much broader concept of what preservation means, and it includes the fact that historic areas and historic properties can change. When we talk about preserving, we do not mean freezing in time. You're not putting a building under a bell jar and stopping its evolution and change. You're managing the character of change of a building or of an area, a district, in a way that you can still interpret its original character while also accommodating changing uses and needs. Now, the preservation movement is actually a lot older than people might realize, and particularly the concept of managing the character of building and design review and design guidelines, which come along with historic preservation. There are laws on the books in Salem, North Carolina from the 1740s in which the residents were required to see that their log structures were properly notched and fitted because the ordinance said, otherwise, through unfitting ways of building, the community is molested. And then preservation as we know it in the 1840s, the Mount Vernon Ladies Society began its movement to acquire and save Mount Vernon. And then across the country, after a series of wood-framed fires in our downtown commercial areas, many communities began adopting laws that required downtowns to be built of brick. That in itself was sort of a design guideline that started establishing areas that had a certain kind of visual continuity. So throughout the Midwest in particular, our Victorian area downtown main streets are almost always brick. Well, there was a law that was mandating that. And then in the 1890s, the New York City Arts Commission began reviewing public works projects. All of the subway entry stations and public art features in Central Park, etc., were reviewed by the New York City Arts Commission. And then in the teens, Eastern seaboard cities, particularly in Baltimore and New York, began establishing zoning that influenced building shape and character. And the ones that we're most familiar with, of course, are the stair-stepped buildings of New York City that were created by zoning envelopes with the intent of opening up the street for light and air. The first local historic preservation ordinance was adopted by Charleston, South Carolina in 1931 because Yankees were coming down and raiding the city and taking historic building parts back up to New York City for their fancy townhomes. And so the city, to put a stop to that, adopted the Old and Historic District. Then the federal government became most actively involved, although it had some earlier legal involvements with the National Landmarks Program. In 1966, when the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted, and that set up a network of state historic preservation officers and providing assistance to local communities across the country. Now, what is historic? Many people consider buildings to be historic are those that are the first or the oldest or the biggest or where George Washington slept. And certainly those are important to us. Obviously they are. And Monterey certainly has a fine collection of some of the oldest and the most important in terms of the history of the state of California. But that is a very narrow definition of what an historic property may be. Historic properties are often contributing properties. They are sets of buildings that help establish the character of a neighborhood, that help to tell the story of the history of an area, of how it may have evolved, and to convey a sense of place and time. Many of these are buildings that if they were standing out by themselves, you wouldn't consider to be historic landmarks. And they gather their strength and their importance from the fact that they're a part of a set. And the concept of historic districts and historic areas is an important one from that respect. Now, generally speaking, to be historic, we think of a building being associated with significant events or people. And now that might be a significant event that has a narrow point in time. A famous battle, for example, or a famous speech might be a significant event. But many times an event is a period of time in our community during which important things were going on. So the era in which the fishing industry and the canning industry was a paramount part of the economy of Monterey, for example, is an event. It just happens to have a time period. In that sense, we often talk about a period of significance that spans several decades in many cases. But a building may also be significant, or a district may be significant because they're representative of distinctive types or styles of buildings, or they represent outstanding design or craftsmanship, or at least a period in evolution of design. So a vernacular building type that was very popular in the history of the community might be something that would be historically significant. Now, people also sometimes wonder, well, how in the world can a landmark structure be significant and then my little cottage and a nice little row of houses be significant as well? Well, in many cases, we tend to organize historic properties at different levels of their importance. And the National Register, which is the sort of father of inventories of historic buildings, has 3 different categories. And many communities and states have similar kinds of hierarchies in the way that they rate buildings. And generally speaking, buildings of national significance are those that have helped to tell a portion of the story of the evolution of our country. Others may be important to the history and the evolution of the state. And others simply are important to the local community. All of these are historic properties. They don't have to have a national event or a national personality attached to them in order to be considered to be significant. Individual buildings, again, draw their greatest value in many cases from their context. A row of structures that might be even adapted to new use, such as this row in Pacific Grove, illustrates that historic preservation doesn't mean freezing something in time. Now, the criteria often for significance include also not only its association with historic periods and places, but also that the building still retains enough of its original building fabric so that you can tell what its character was like during its period of historic significance. And so when people evaluate a property, they look to see if it helps to convey the character of the period of significance of the property, and whether it retains a majority of the building features and even of the structural systems that were used to build the building. If you totally were to replace all of the ornamental detail of one of the cottages in that row in Pacific Grove, for example, with new material, you might have a very good copy, but it wouldn't be the genuine antique because you would have replaced all of the original material. So retaining a certain degree of integrity is one of the key criteria as well. While we may think of the oldest buildings, the adobes, and certainly the Victorian era, highly ornamented cottages, the sort of San Francisco painted ladies types of buildings as being historic, many communities are also recognizing a great diversity of early buildings that have historic value because they do help to convey a sense of time and place and character in the community. So in some cases, even little Spanish and Mission Revival houses, particularly where a neighborhood may remain intact, or Craftsman-era cottages, can also be considered historically significant depending on the situation. Well, why do we bother to worry about preserving those kinds of buildings? Well, fundamentally, so we'll know who we are. I think our country is yearning for a sense of connection with our heritage and with our past at many levels. As our society changes and change occurs so swiftly, some sense of continuity and link with our culture, I think, is increasingly important to all of us. So fundamentally, we do it so we'll know who we are and that we'll have a connection with our past. And we will preserve the fact of our history. But there are also some very practical reasons that help supplement that movement. One of which is to enhance livability. Many of those historic structures make good, serviceable buildings, and many of those historic neighborhoods in particular make wonderfully livable neighborhoods. They're built to a scale that is attractive, they're friendly to pedestrians, they encourage neighborly interaction, and for that reason, they are particularly practical, and many, many communities are seeking to preserve them for that reason. There also are some environmental reasons. By saving older buildings, we are in fact recycling resources. We are not throwing away building materials that have already been harvested and milled and crafted and assembled, and there was energy taken to assemble and create that building. And if you demolish it, you throw away all of that, which is called the embodied energy of the building. You obviously save other energy in that you're not harvesting other new building materials or creating them in the process. The buildings can also be simply efficient from an energy standpoint as well. And because older neighborhoods tend to be closer in neighborhoods, our cities are able to run more efficient transportation systems and reduce the dependence on the automobile. And there are also economic development reasons. And I'm going to let Don take over in just a minute. But what we've seen in many communities is that protecting an area will enhance property values. It will create a climate for investment because property owners know that if they maintain their property in an appropriate manner that's compatible with the historic character, that others around them will as well, and that will reinforce property values. We're presently working in Little Rock, Arkansas, for the state of Arkansas around the governor's mansion, which has been an historic district with a design review system in place for 20 years. And we recently were at the city looking at the code enforcement department's mapping of dilapidated and dangerous and code violation buildings in the core area of Little Rock. And we compared a map of 20 years ago with a map of last year. And it didn't have a line drawn on it delineating the historic district boundary, which is about 40 blocks of residential structures. But you could almost exactly draw the boundary of the historic district because on the new map, that area is almost totally cleaned up in terms of building violations, code violations, and health and safety issues, in part because that neighborhood has been one in which people knew that if they invested in renovating one of the buildings, that investment would be protected. And it's a dramatic example of the impact that having an historic district in particular can have on a community. So, what's going on here? Okay. Don.
Picture of the house that Nori said he would buy me in Carmel if I'd come here today, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, mayors, and thank you, cities, and thank you all for being here. I very much appreciate being here today. I have the best job in America. Nobody has a better job than I do. I get to go to about 100 towns a year of every size, from little villages of 450 people in the middle of Kansas to New York and Chicago and Seattle and Detroit and Philadelphia and every place in between. I suppose in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been on the Monterey Peninsula maybe a dozen times, and what a great part of America this is, and how worldwide the natural environment is here. But 2 weeks ago, I went to Australia, and I came back and I flew on Qantas Airlines, and those goofy in-flight magazines had an article about driving up the California coast. And interestingly, in the section of that article that dealt with this part, with Carmel and Monterey, what they talked about, in fact, was not the beautiful natural environment here, which it certainly is, but the quality of the built environment here. That's something that's strong here and maybe not as widely recognized. I think as I begin, it's important for me to confess my kind of perspective on the world, and that is that I am a crass, unrepentant, real estate capitalist, Republican type, and unapologetic about it. I believe, in fact, in the unique qualities of real estate as an investment, and I think it's absolutely a good thing that people make money in real estate. I'm for that. In fact, I'll confess that it's the economic opportunities in historic preservation that both brought me into this as an interest 20 years ago and continues to be my main professional practice. Preservationists often don't like to view it that way, but in fact, the vast majority of what we call historic preservation or historic buildings are real estate. In the end, they are real estate. And the principles that apply to historic buildings are the same principles that are applicable to real estate in general. After spending almost 20 years to listening to people like Norrie and Bruce and others who really know historic preservation, I would suggest to you that the other values that historic preservation represents, aesthetic values and cultural values and sociological values and political values and psychological values, in fact, in the long run, are probably all more important than the economic values of preservation. But I don't know anything about those things. So what I'm going to talk today about is the economic significance of historic preservation. As the mayor mentioned when he started out, and Norrie just mentioned, I think a very legitimate question to be asked is, what is the impact on individual property values of local historic districts? Crucial area, appropriately to be asked. But since there's a panel on that this afternoon, I'm going to defer that narrow issue until then. So what I want to do this morning really is talk on 2 different levels. The first being the kind of significance of historic preservation economically in the large scale, and then secondarily the impact, the economic significance of local historic districts. I'm going to give you some lists. That's really what I do for a living, is make lists, and these are in no particular order, but I'll start in kind of the significance of preservation on the general level. Most of my work is in either downtowns or neighborhood commercial districts. I see 100 a year. I've done it for 15 years. I've been in 1,000 towns, many of whom have sustainably successful, long-running downtown revitalization programs. I have never been in one. Never. Any place. I haven't been there. I haven't heard about it. I haven't read about it. Nobody's told me about it. A sustainably successful downtown revitalization program that did not have historic preservation as a key component of that. Now, that doesn't mean it's not theoretically possible, I suppose, but I've never heard about it, never seen it, never been there. That's for lots of reasons, I think, and I hope to get into some. But one of them, and it's an overlap of what Norrie just showed a slide of, is residential areas. If you asked me to, I could probably make you a list of 20 criteria upon which to judge the health of a downtown, economic health of a downtown. But if I were limited to one, it would be this. Are there people on the street? And if the answer is yes, it's successful, and if the answer is no, it's not, independent of any other variable. The nature of historic buildings in downtowns is that they are pedestrian-oriented. It is a natural reinforcement of, in fact, how healthy downtowns work. Now, I don't know enough about Monterey County to pass judgment here, so I'm not casting aspersions on any human being in this county, any of the 3 towns, any place else. But across the country, there's a whole bunch of $120,000 a year industrial development recruiters who haven't figured out yet that downtown revitalization is economic development, but they're still wearing the 1956 Nehru jacket. Downtown revitalization isn't about cute buildings. Downtown revitalization is about economic development. The reason we have economic development of any kind, any place, is to create jobs, increase the tax base, to generate loan demand and deposits to local financial institutions, to increase the tax base. Why do we have downtown revitalization? To create jobs, to spur new investment, to increase the tax base, not something else. Downtown revitalization is economic development, and historic preservation consistently is a key role in any downtown sustainably successful downtown revitalization effort. I kind of do some stuff in the context of historic buildings, but my real function in life is as a real estate and economic development consultant. And in an increasingly globalized and homogenized international economy, the competitive edge of any given community in the economic development area will be its ability to differentiate itself from any place else. In a great book, Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, Marco Polo is describing to the Kublai Khan the cities of the Khan's vast empire. And in depicting the city of Trude, here's what he tells the Khan. If on arriving at Trude I had not read the city's name written in big letters, I would have thought I was landing at the same airport from which I had taken off. The suburbs they drove me through were no different from the others, with the same little greenish and yellowish houses. Following the same signs, we swung around the same flower beds in the same squares. The downtown streets displayed goods, packages, signs that had not changed at all. This was the first time I'd come to Trude, but already I knew the hotel where I happened to be lodged. I had already heard and spoken my dialogues with the buyers and sellers of hardware. I had ended other days identically, looking through the same goblets at the same swaying navels. When I come to Trude, I asked myself, and already I wanted to leave. You can resume your flight whenever you like, they said to me, but you will arrive at another Trude, absolutely the same, detail by detail. The world is covered by a sole Trude which does not begin and does not end. Only the name of the airport changes. Well, it seems to me that the most powerful economic argument for historic preservation is to avoid the world covered by a sole Trude which does not begin and does not end. In economics, it is the differentiated product that commands a monetary premium. If, in the long run, we want to attract capital, to attract investment in our community, we must differentiate them from anywhere else. And it's our built environment that expresses, perhaps better than anything else, our diversity, our identity, our individuality, our differentiation. I'm in the business of economic development. And early in the next century, the workforce is going to be divided roughly in thirds. A third of us are going to be like I am now, totally locationally indifferent. But it won't be just consultants like me. The actuary, the stockbroker, the graphic artist, the import-export dealer, the software engineer, the technical writer. These people will be able to work any place where there's a telephone and electricity, and they'll be a third of the entire workforce. Another third will have to be attached to a specific place. The minister, the dentist, the high school teacher, the cop, the city manager, the nurse, the retail clerk. These people will have to live near their work. But because every community will need them, the choice of which place to live and work will be almost limitless. Therefore, 2/3 of the entire workforce won't care where the port is, or the interstate, or the mine, or the railroad, or the factory, or the mill. They will live where they choose to, and that is going to be made on that cliche, quality of life. We'll each have a different definition of what constitutes quality of life for ourselves and our family, and that's as it should be. But the 5 senses will play an important role in each of our definitions. The 5 senses: the sense of place, the sense of evolution, the sense of ownership — we must feel the community is really ours — the sense of identity, and the sense of community itself. Last year, when I was on a trip to California, I was in Sacramento and picked up the Sacramento Bee one morning and read a local columnist, Steve Wigand. Here's what he wrote. "And from the brave new world of the Internet comes the following new term, generica. Fast food joints, strip malls, and subdivisions, as in, we were so lost in generica, I didn't know what city it was." Well, generica is not just a California phenomena or a city or a suburban phenomena. Generica is happening everywhere, and I would suggest it is at the heart of the challenge of economic development, community development, placemaking in the 21st century. Generica undermines all 5 of those senses: the sense of place, of evolution, of ownership, of identity, and of community. And historic preservation, I would suggest to you, builds on all 5 of those senses: the sense of place, of evolution, of ownership, of identity, and of community. This is going to sound like some liberal crusader sociological nonsense stuff. And that's an issue of neighborhood diversity. But in fact, if there is an emerging concurrence between the right and the left, and the white and the black, and the Republicans and Democrats, and liberals and conservatives, that is, we're not healthy, and that includes economically healthy as a community and as a society, if we have neighborhoods that are strictly divided by race or by income or by educational level. And we spend huge amounts of public resources figuring out how to accommodate housing for poor people in new neighborhoods. And we struggle on how we can come up with spend more, because across the political spectrum, we've come to understand how important that neighborhood diversity is. I did a study a year ago in Indiana on the significance of, economic significance was what it's supposed to be, of local historic districts in 5 cities and towns and cities in Indiana. Here's what was learned. We took and we graphed the demographic characteristics of each community by race, by income, by occupation, by education. The city as a whole and the populations within the historic districts. And you know what happened? The historic districts, unlike any other neighborhoods, were in fact a mirror of the demographic characteristics of the community as a whole. They automatically were providing that neighborhood diversity. Other neighborhoods might have been all black or all white, all rich or all poor, but it's very stratified. The historic neighborhoods had that breadth. One exception to that, by the way, and that is on the income side. The historic districts had more of both the poorest and the richest than the community as a whole, as if that's such a bad thing. Preservationists might like to claim, well, that's some kind of magic magnetism of historic buildings. That ain't it. It is the nature of our older neighborhoods. The housing in those neighborhoods was built of a variety of sizes, scales, qualities, nature. And when you have a variety of choices, you get a variety of human beings who live in those choices. And I think from a long-range economic and a short-range sociological and political, that's very important. And neighborhoods like Spaghetti Hill here in Monterey have that spread of the nature of in fact, who lives there. I've been involved, not as long as either Bruce or Nori, but I've been involved in historic preservation as a greedy capitalist for about not quite 20 years. And the preservation movement itself has evolved a lot over that time, and I think Nori pointed it out. Preservation no longer is the kind of realm of mansions of dead white guys in places where George Washington slept. Frankly, that kind of preservation kind of bores me. It's important, I guess. It is not my deal. Today's preservation is much more of a neighborhood-based, locally based, what can we do in this community kind of significance. One of the great small towns in America is West Palm Beach, Florida. Great mayor, Nancy Graham. West Palm Beach, if you don't know it, Palm Beach is where the great huge houses, mansions were. And there's a canal, and then West Palm Beach is where all the people who worked in the mansions during the day lived. So it is a community largely of very modest housing. In the last 5 or 6 years, they've created 10 residential historic districts. And if you would drive through them and look around, you'd say, why in the hell is this place an historic district? There's no mansions here. There's no great architecture here. That community understood. They used that local historic district as a way to get that neighborhood's voice at City Hall. If there's been an evolution in preservation in the last 20 years, it has moved from preservation being the end of something. We save old buildings to save old buildings, to preservation being a vehicle for much, frankly, more important roles than that. I want to talk briefly about neighborhood cycles. There's only 3 kinds of human beings who believe that real estate only goes up in value. 1, idiots. 2, people who've had their real estate license for less than a month. And 3, those people who are insomniacs and stay up on late night TV and watch those get-rich-quick scams on late night television. Real estate goes up in value and down in value. It goes both directions. And so do the neighborhoods within which that real estate exists. But consistently throughout the country, large place, small place, rich place, poor place, when a community has suffered a downfall and begins to recover, the place that recovers first are the historic districts. There's a great book called Stone and Its Substitutes by J.B. Jackson. Here's what he writes, and it's absolutely on target. When hard times, which eventually come to every community, no matter what its size or wealth, what makes survival possible and desirable is not its archaeological identity, but its ability to continue. And it continues because some structures, some institutions, and facilities provide continuity. These are the landmarks, and they stand for community, continuity, identity, for links with the past and the future. In the contemporary American community, these roles are what counteract our mobility and fragmentation and forgetfulness of history. Almost right off Norrie's slide about why we preserve. He's a great, very successful, very wealthy developer in Portland, Bill Nato. Done lots and lots and lots of great real estate development, new and rehab in downtown Portland. And he told me once, and it makes absolute sense from an economic perspective, that another benefit of historic preservation is it tends to be a counter-cyclical balance. When things are down, often the rehabilitation of existing buildings is the kind of affordable investment that somebody can make. So some plumbers and electricians and carpenters and painters are put to work. You have great tourism here. Wonderful, big economic impact. Let me tell you about heritage tourism as opposed to tourism in general. People who go to visit historic places stay longer, visit twice as many places, and spend 2.5 times as much money to visitors who go to some place for something else. Now that has 2 alternative ways to look at it. One, with the same number of people, we can generate 2.5 times as much money. Or conversely, especially in a place like the Monterey Peninsula, where you're saying, my God, what would we do with any more people? In fact, you can generate the same amount as money with 40% as many people as other kinds of tourism. Well, so that's kind of a general context. There's one that I would be negligent if I didn't mention, and that is the issue of job creation. In the end, economic development ought to be about having people have jobs. And historic preservation is about that. In California, $1 million spent rehabilitating an old historic building creates 10 more jobs than a typical manufacturer in California, manufacturing $1 million worth of goods. In fact, it creates 5 more jobs than even manufacturing $1 million worth of computers, and 6 more jobs than spending $1 million in new construction. if you're serious about economic development being job creation, then historic preservation ought to be part of that equation. Let me talk now, I'll move to the other level, and that is the effect of historic districts. And again, I'm going to leave the value change issue till this afternoon. I've looked at historic districts, both in Indiana and elsewhere. Those that have the greatest positive impact on real estate values are those with these characteristics. One, there are clear written guidelines. Number two, those guidelines are consistently and firmly enforced. Number three, there is staff to the Preservation Commission. Number four, there is educational outreach, so people are enlightened about what this all means. And fifth, there is a combination of carrots and sticks, a combination of both incentives and restrictions. Some places have tried to get by with one or the other, but let me just tell you what happens. When you have only sticks, only a set of rules, you can't do this and you have to do that, there is a great deal of owner resentment. There are owners and architects and attorneys always looking for loopholes so they can follow the letter of the law as opposed to its intent. And the concentration is exclusively on the property as opposed to the neighborhood or broader. So that's what happens when you have only sticks. When you have only carrots, actually it becomes an entitlement there. It's kind of like welfare for real estate owners. They think we're entitled to give us some money for something. It is, I would argue, a subsidy for an exclusively private benefit. It creates, when you have only carrots, public skepticism, and my fiscal responsibility side has to question whether that's kind of rational public policy. Often said, it's not, it's heard every place, well, geez, if we have to go through that stuff, you know, those people are just there, they're sitting in that commission to tell us no. Well, I've looked at the records of Preservation Commission after Preservation Commission all over the country. The initial approval rate, that is, of the applications come before the commission, where the commission, the first time it came before them, they said yes, has a wide range, something between 85 and 90%, saying yes the first time through. So this issue that there's somehow some huge barrier to something happen just ain't so. I'm a real estate proponent, but real estate as an investment is different than IBM stock as an investment, in that the decision that a real estate owner makes about a building is going to affect that community for a generation or two or three. That is not true when I buy a piece of IBM stock or a gold bullion or a Beanie Baby. It doesn't affect the rest of you. The real estate decision does. And the sheer argument that this review process of an historic commission is going to add a week or two to the process and that's somehow unfair, I have to tell you, is absolute nonsense. When it's affecting a community for 2 or 3 generations, a week or two is an insignificant variable. Some other just factual things that have been discovered. In historic districts, there is a higher reinvestment rate than in other similar areas not historic districts. Secondly, there is a higher reinvestment rate after the historic district created than before the historic district created. And lower downtown Denver is one of the great examples in America about that, and I can come back to that. Next, when there's an historic district, the rehabilitation that takes place is of higher quality than when no such district exists. Here's my theory of the day. Well, one of them, I might have 14 before the day's over. I think when somebody 50 years from now writes the history of the historic preservation movement at the end of the 20th century, the successes are not going to be measured in the number of the old buildings that were saved. I would suggest to you that the biggest impact of historic preservation will be the quality of new construction that took place under the influence of historic preservation ordinances. Across the country, where there are the best historic preservation ordinances, the best, highest quality new construction is taking place. You all know about that old cliche in real estate. What are the 3 most important things in real estate? Location, 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 and all that stuff. But think about what that means for a minute. It's not that the 3 most important things are roof, walls, and floor. Real estate is peculiar as an asset in that almost all of its value comes external from the property lines. That location, location, location means that the value of the individual parcel comes from the context within which that parcel exists. The primary economic purpose of historic districts is to protect and then enhance the context within which any given property exists. Now, if it's all this good news, isn't there somebody that has to be taken a hit, that suffers if one of these historic districts is taking place? Yes. Two types of real estate investors suffer in historic districts. And this is not pejorative saying this is a good or bad, just factually correct. People who are speculators suffer because profits from speculation comes out of two things, uncertainty and volatility, and both of those things are diminished with historic districts. And second category of real estate that suffers under historic district is a short-term buyers and flippers. They will suffer. That doesn't mean that once in a while they won't make a buck, but generally will suffer relative to someplace else. I have no legal or moral objective whatsoever to people whose segment in the real estate business is either the speculative side or the flippers. They perform a valuable function on a composite basis. And if a community's emphasis in terms of the kind of investment they're trying to encourage is the speculative or the flipping one, do not create a local historic district, because it will discourage that type of real estate investment. I want to close with just three things. I brought with me on the plane, not for this conference, I did not have it in mind. I'm having to read it for another purpose. But a study just finished in Maryland, 6 case studies by the investment banking firm of Lippman, Frizzell, and Mitchell in suburban Maryland. I did not bring it for this purpose, but I want to read you about 4 lines from them. And I'm doing it because of this. One is, I didn't bring it for this purpose, but it's the newest. Not even, actually, this is a draft copy. It's not even going to be in print for 2 or 3 more months. And I've done a bunch of these studies, but I didn't do this one. Some appraisal and investment banking firm did. And it's their own deal. But here's 4 of their sentences. Private investment is typically higher within the historic district than in the rest of the jurisdiction. Over the long run, 18 to 22 years, properties in the 6 historic districts, their case studies, have on average appreciated 28.9% faster than the properties in the same jurisdiction outside the historic district. Properties in these 6 historic districts paid their share of real estate taxes and more, despite the fact that all historic districts contained a high percentage of the jurisdiction's exempt properties. The historic district has given property owners greater security in making improvements because of the higher design standards set for all properties in the neighborhood. And local observers credit the district with fostering an economic environment conducive to investment, both residential and commercial, and positive economic activity. I didn't do it. But that response is consistent with the analysis that's been done on a number of levels. 2 last things. Some of you are friends of mine or preservationist friends of mine. You're going to be mad at me for saying this, and I just have to apologize in advance. But I'm not much of a person for creating villains. And lots of times I think we as preservationists often say, how can they not get it? They being somebody other than us. Property owners, the city, the bank, somebody else. How come they can't get it? Well, and we act like they're all evil, mean, stupid, or ugly. Well, I don't believe that. How would they get? Where would you learn such a thing? Where would you learn that historic preservation has positive economic ramifications? Where would you learn that if you didn't learn it from preservationists? And if they haven't gotten it, it's because we as preservationists haven't done a good enough job to communicate that message. We don't have to phony up the facts. The facts are on the side of the positive economic impact of historic preservation. We don't have to make up something. But if somebody doesn't get it, that's our fault and not theirs. I would suggest to you, however, that both this forum, that the city of Monterey, having Bruce doing work here, that the cities of PG and of Carmel, having Nori doing work over there, in fact is part of this ongoing process of kind of helping us all understand better. And since my area is economics in this session, I want to finish with the great Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith, what he said. The preservation movement has one great curiosity. There is never retrospective controversy or regret. Preservationists are the only people in the world who are invariably confirmed in their wisdom after the fact. Thank you all very much.
Well, I would like to thank all three cities as well for doing this workshop. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss, educate, and inform people, and also have an opportunity to have a lot of people with questions, hopefully have them answered sometime today. So I would like to thank all three cities for doing this. I think it's a rare opportunity and a wonderful chance, because normally in the preservation communities, you end up having this type of discussion around a specific project that is in a crisis stage. A developer has come in, wants to tear down something. Local people suddenly discover that it's of value. They don't want it torn down. Time is urgent. A lot of money is involved. A lot of money has been spent. And everybody's in a crisis mode rather than a thoughtful mode of trying to learn and understand something. The problem I have with this first section is I was given 15 minutes, and I'm talking about Section 106, which has to do with the federal involvement in historic preservation, and that's normally a 3-day seminar. CEQA is normally a 2-day seminar, and then my comments about Don Ripkeman normally are about half a day. So I'm going to have to talk very rapidly and move along quickly. Don didn't say this, but in terms of resources, if we're not getting the people to get it, this book on the economics of historic preservation that Don authored, and I get no money from the sales of this publication, I have to tell you, is probably one of the best books around for a layperson to understand historic preservation issues. There is a catalog of books and so on out on the table, and this book is listed in it, so I highly recommend it. I first heard Don quite a few years ago, and I was amazed that he was saying things very clearly about economics that before I had always seen in long charts with X and Y and Z and bars and things that as an architect, although I'm visually oriented, they sort of affected me the same way that structural design calculations and graphs work. I didn't understand it. He put it into a very clear sense. As a result, in most of my discussions now on historic preservation, on why one should try and preserve something, I bypass the whole emotional, it's good for you, it's the right thing to do argument, and get right into the money and the jobs and the fact that economically it makes sense. So I think that Don has done a wonderful job in helping us understand that. I'd like to go very quickly into the federal part of this, and I have 2 handouts that are out on the desk, so I'm going to be talking briefly from them, so you don't need to take notes. It's also very confusing, so if you take notes, you may get lost in the process. I'm a member of the President's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which reviews federal undertakings and is involved in 106, so I'm fairly familiar with the process. But at the federal level, Section 106 came about because of the LBJ Great Society programs when Congress passed the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and it's codified. I know you'll want to write this down and memorize it. It's a very useful number. It's 36 CFR Part 800. It's very good bedtime reading if you're having trouble sleeping. But it specifies a process where federal agencies are required to consider the effects of their undertaking on historic properties. In general terms, an agency head is required to take into account the effects of an undertaking on historic properties and then afford the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation an opportunity to review and comment. This process is commonly called Section 106. A similar requirement under Section 110F of the National Historic Preservation Act exists for National Historic Landmarks. Cleverly, Section 106 refers to the section in the Act. It's required to be completed before approval or expenditure of federal funds before a license is granted, and it can affect a variety of things. In some cases, it may be a federal undertaking where the post office wants to tear down an Art Deco building that's in a downtown area. But it also includes things like licensing permits, so that if an airport wants to change the lights on a runway, that may trigger an undertaking because FAA requires a permit for that. So it's a very diverse number of things. In many cases, the scope of what is included is called an undertaking, and that includes funded, licensed, or whether they're actually carried out by the federal agency or not. So, for example, a local housing rehabilitation program that uses community development block grant funds or is funded by HUD is required to go through Section 106. State highway projects are subject to Section 106 if they're funded by federal highway funds. So a large number of projects are subject to this. And it applies to all historic properties, and these are defined as properties that are listed or are eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And generally, some degree of review is required for properties over 50 years old to determine whether they actually are eligible for the register. The procedure for completing Section 106 review generally takes up to 5 different steps depending on the involvement. The first is an identification and evaluation. And here, the project is tried to decide, is there an undertaking, and is there going to be, in effect, a change in the character of any historic property? The first part of this analysis is to determine the area of potential effect, called APE. And this is a geographic area that might be affected by whatever is being undertaken. Once the agency identifies the proposed action as an undertaking, it identifies any potential historic properties within the APE, and it may be done by a local survey, there may be one in place, it may be done by the agency. There's a variety of ways of making this happen. Once potential historic properties are identified, they're evaluated for eligibility to the National Register. The Advisory Council can review this determination and see if it agrees with it. The second step, once this is done, is to assess the effects. Are there negative effects? Are there adverse effects? Are there no effects? And such effects may include not only physical destruction or damage, but isolation of the property from its setting when the setting qualifies for a National Register. In many cases, you can avoid all of this if the property is being worked on, for example, is done, and if it's a rehabilitation, that it's done to the Secretary of the Interior standards, or the property is being transferred with covenants that protect the historic resources, and that immediately changes the entire process to be a very quick one. If no effect or no potential for change is found, then the State Historic Preservation Office, the SHPO, can review it, notify the Advisory Council, and again, you're off the hook in terms of doing more. Step 3 is consultation. In this case, there is work done to mitigate any adverse effects, and this may be changing the scope of the project, relocating the project, modifying it in some ways so that the effects that are happening to the resource are minimal. And again, this can be done in consultation with the State Office of Historic Preservation and the Advisory Council. Typical mitigation measures may include doing historic American Building Survey documentation, recording the property, and where a substantial change or destruction of the resource is unavailable, this may be the only method that you have to try and mitigate the problem. In many cases, you end up with a memorandum of agreement between the agency and the State Office of Historic Preservation. When I mention agency, in many cases this may involve cities or pass-through funds from the federal government to the state to cities, and that's why local people such as you need to be aware of what's happening in terms of Section 106. The fourth step is council comment. The Advisory Council is required to comment on all federal undertakings on historic resources. When a memorandum of agreement is reached during the consultation process, the acceptance of the MOA by the Advisory Council serves as the final step. Step 5 is proceeding with the undertaking. And in this case, finally, if the agency proceeds with the project in accordance with the MOA, if one has been made, then everything's fine. If no MOA has been reached, the agency is required to take the Advisory Council comments into account during the undertaking. There are some alternatives to this type of an arrangement. In some cases, you can have a case-by-case review, which is what I've been describing before, but you also can have programmatic agreements for large projects that may have many steps or a large number of resources that need to be reviewed in a variety of different ways. For example, our firm was working on the Rocky Mountain Laboratory in Hamilton, Montana. It's the college campus of about 10 historic buildings that are National Historic Landmark District. We worked on a programmatic agreement that would cover any changes to these buildings. If it met this agreement, they wouldn't have to go through 106. So every time the laboratory wanted to put an air conditioning unit or change internal walls, if they met this agreement, they didn't have to go through the process over and over again. This type of programmatic agreement can be done through the Advisory Council and the State Office of Historic Preservation, and then everyone agrees to the programmatic agreement, signs off on it, and you can proceed. Okay, what I have given you very quickly is an overview, and I've left out an enormous amount of stuff. So the point here is to give you just a general understanding. A little knowledge is dangerous, so don't take this too seriously until you review it in more detail if you're involved in a project that may have Section 106 review required. The other part that really gets involved in looking at resources from the legal end is CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, which was passed in 1970. And this is a state act that mimics or follows from the National Environmental Policy Act, or commonly called NEPA. The intent was to have agencies consider the environmental implications of actions proposed by their agencies. CEQA applies to all governmental agencies at all levels, whether local, regional, or state, and essentially requires these agencies that are contemplating an action to consider the environmental effects where they are adverse to the environment and consider feasible means to reduce those effects. The primary vehicle for considering this is through a document called an Environmental Impact Report, or EIR. And I think significant to our discussion is that an EIR looks at a variety of things from traffic to noise to pollution, but in the subject of this meeting, we're really talking about effects on historic properties, and it's defined as objects of historic or aesthetic significance. And therefore, agencies are required to consider the potential effect of any action that they're taking on a historic resource. So when's an EIR required? An agency must produce one when a proposed project has a significant effect on the environment. And a project can be any action that has potential for resulting in any physical change, the environment, whether directly or indirectly. It also may include the adoption of a general plan, a specific plan, zoning ordinance, or the like by a local government. The term project does not necessarily refer to land use. It has also been held to include such wide-ranging activities as regulation of VOC content in architectural coatings by the Bay Area Quality Management District, to suspension of a hunting season by revoking hunting permits for black bear by the Department of Fish and Game. So it's a pretty broad area that you have to deal with. CEQA applies to all projects either carried out or approved by a government agency. And so they're privately funded projects, if they require a permit issued by a government agency, are under this statute. It applies only to discretionary projects, which require an exercise of judgment or deliberation, and not to ministerial projects. So for example, if you're getting a routine building department where you go into the counter and pick up a permit, you do not need to get involved in this. It's only when there requires some discretionary action. An agency may prepare a master EIR for multiple projects, and again, it's designed to simplify and expedite the environmental review process within the scope of a master EIR. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it's somewhat similar to programmatic agreements, where that you define what the overall scope might be, and then if a project within this master agreement meets that scope, you don't have to do more. So what's the procedure for complying with CEQA? Environmental review of a project takes place in several discrete steps. Out in the lobby, there's a series of flow charts which you can follow if you're really into this, and it tells you if you do this, do that, and if you don't do that, go in some other direction, and so on. The first, you have to define what a project is, and then determine what the action is relative to that project. And it's not subject to one of the statutory or categorical exemptions. Then you have to be evaluating the project to see if there's a possibility that there may be a significant environmental effect. If there is one, then the lead agency, which may be different from the responsible agency, and I'm not going to get into that, if there's more than one agency involved, prepares an initial study. The initial study is a document that's required to contain a description of the project, including its location, identification of environmental effects caused by the project, including documentation and so on and so forth. If it turns out that there is no negative effect, you can come up with an agency preparing a negative declaration, or neg-dec, which says that there is approved and that you don't have to go any farther. If there is a significant unmitigated adverse effect, then you have to prepare a draft EIR. The scope session is done to determine what are the issues that need to be covered in the EIR. After that, the agency may begin preparation of the draft EIR, and it's required to have a number of elements. The most significant of these for our purposes is identification of adverse environmental effects, significantly having to do with historic or aesthetic resources. The mitigation measures need to be included, as well as a range of project alternatives, including no project, so that if the project didn't go ahead, as a standard, what would be the effect on the environment. Once the draft EIR has been completed, the agency is required to notify the public, seek public comments for a certain period of time. If new significant information is added as a result of this process, then changes are made to the draft EIR, and it must be recirculated again for additional public comment. The public comments must be evaluated and responded to by the agency in the final EIR. Typically, a final EIR incorporates the draft EIR by reference. In all of these steps, there has to be a good faith effort to look at the resources and the effect on them. And one of the things that typically happens is when there's a lawsuit, most of the lawsuits are won or lost not on the content of the EIR, but the steps weren't followed correctly, or somebody deliberately tried to short-circuit the process or do something that was counter to what the regulations are. So it's very important to follow them through. So what's a significant effect? And this is, for our purposes, means whether there is an adverse impact to the character-defining features of a property that might be eligible or listed on the National Register or could be listed. One of these is the ability to eliminate important examples of major periods of California history or prehistory. Additionally, a mandatory finding of significance is required when a project has an environmental effect which, while individually limited, when you consider them all at once, end up being a major impact. And in many cases, people have tried to segment these off and say, well, there isn't a very big impact here, and then there isn't a big impact here. The courts have ruled that you need to be considering all of the impacts and how they come together. So what's an EIR's effect on the project? The government agency cannot merely consider an EIR and then approve a project, ignoring the adverse environmental effects. If the project is approved, the agency must issue findings. The first set of findings states how the agency has responded to the adverse environmental effects. If the agency has jurisdiction to make a change to the project and avoid or substantially reduce the adverse effect, it must either make the change or provide substantial evidence that specific economic, social, or other considerations make such a change unfeasible. A second set of findings is the statement of overriding considerations. Often an agency must balance the environmental and considerations with other important public policies. If the project is approved through the adverse environmental effects and they remain significant, even though after they have been mitigated, then a statement of overriding considerations must be issued. This statement sets forth how the agency balanced the competing policy interests after its reasoning for a decision. After the project is approved, the agency must file a notice of determination, which initiates a final 30-day period of review. That goes through those two things very, very quickly. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nori, I think, at this point. And, oh wait, I'm supposed to talk about CLGs. Okay, we got a 2-minute CLG statement. Certified local governments are also included in the National Historic Preservation Act, and they provide for certification or approval of local historic preservation programs by the SHPO and the Secretary of the Interior. And there's two main reasons for doing this, that there are funds that are appropriated for grants and aid from the Historic Preservation Fund that are passed on through the SHPO to certified local governments. In addition to this, there's technical assistance. Monterey is a certified local government and has been taking advantage of some of these grants. There also is greater autonomy for local programs. If you are a CLJ, you can nominate properties directly to the National Register and short-circuit some of the other regulations and requirements. The criteria to become a CLG are actually fairly straightforward. You have to enforce appropriate state and local preservation legislation, establish and maintain a qualified historic preservation review commission. You have to provide for public participation in preservation activities, and perform a few other functions designated under the National Historic Preservation Act, and maintain a system of surveying, inventorying, and keeping track of historic resources. The importance of the CLG program is that it integrates historic preservation into the local government program, and it helps to institutionalize historic preservation by making the government a major part of preservation planning. Because most of the work at the CLG level is done by planning staff, it becomes part of the local land use policy, and it gets the local people very much more involved in preservation. It's also a very flexible program. You can customize the program, the grants application, the technical assistance, and so on, and tailor it to your needs. For example, the flexible grants can be used for surveying, for planning studies, for building reuse and feasibility studies, design guidelines, conservation district ordinance, and public education, in addition to a number of other activities. So that was a 2-minute CLG program. Okay, now, back to Nori. Oh no, it's not back to Nori, I'm sorry.
No, the speakers don't have to know. They just have to listen. What we're going to do now is first of all say thank you again to Don and Nori and Bruce, because the information they presented us was just great. So thank you, gentlemen. And before we get into how we apply all this at a local level, we thought we'd give everybody a break, but we have a lot to talk about. So if I could ask you to take 10 minutes, be back in your seats, and we're going to get on with what goes on at a local level. Thank you.